Hey to all Metal Maniacs, welcome to another episode on Iron Horde channel. This time I will be diverting my attention towards one of the most popular subgenres in heavy metal, and I'm speaking about death metal. So I'll be compiling a list of 10 of my favorite death metal albums. So without further ado, let's go straight to the list. Thanks again for joining us for another video on the Iron Horde channel. For those who are new here, our videos contain band suggestion, album reviews, festival reviews, cultural discussions with regards to anything that has to do with heavy metal. So if you like the content, please consider subscribing, liking the video and sharing it on social media in order for us to reach more people and share the word of metal. Before going ahead with the list, I would like to make a premise, that is that these 10 albums that I'm going to mention are not necessarily the best death metal albums ever, although obviously that's very much subjective, but much more the albums that have influenced me throughout the years whilst listening to death metal. They are probably the 10 albums I have listened to the most with regards to the subgenre of death metal. So obviously there will be albums which I have left out, and I advise everyone who would like to suggest albums which I will not mention to put them down in the comment below in order to get the discussion going. So the first album on the list is none other than from the band Obituary, and the album is Cause of Death, released in 1990 by Road Racer Records, which would eventually become Roadrunner Records. This being their second record after their debut album Slowly We Rot, which was also a great album, but I decided to opt for their second one, which is this one right here. The band consists of John Tardy and Donald Tardy, which are brothers. They play vocals and drums respectively, and Trevor Perez and John Murphy on guitars, and Frank Watkins, rest in peace, on bass. As I had noted on another video I did a few weeks ago with regards to my favorite thrash metal albums, which I'm linking up here, this cover art was supposedly going to be used for the album Beneath the Remains by Sepultura, but then eventually the label decided to use that cover art for this album. The first time I was introduced to Obituary, I was given the description that they are a slow death metal band, and my first love in heavy metal being doom metal, obviously I was intrigued by that description and I immediately went to check out Obituary, and this was the first album that came up, and I was immediately hooked with the heaviness, with the violence incorporated in it, which is a different kind of feeling than, although being slow as well like doom metal, but it's a totally different kind of feeling than the traditional doom metal that I was hearing at the time. Yet the power this album holds is incredible, and Obituary in general are a very consistent band. Everyone who's into death metal should first of all get to know Obituary and this album and even the other albums, because they are classic death metal albums and they shouldn't be missed. It also includes a cover of Celtic Frost's Circle of the Tyrants, which is a brilliant rendition of that track, and it's kind of the cherry on the cake basically, because it really completes a magnificent death metal album. If I had to choose my favorite track on this album, it would probably be Chopped in Half. That is my favorite track over here. Second album on this list, I have decided to choose and go for this album right here, which is by the band Master, and the album is on the 7th day God created Master. I really love the title. It's I think a touch of brilliance, nothing complicated, but it's interesting how they grabbed the particular phrase and used it for their own advantage. This album was released in 1991 on Nuclear Blast Records. Very much like the album before it, Cause of Death by Obituary, this album follows that path, that is the slow riffs, guttural vocals, a lot of power behind the tracks. They are quite similar in style with Obituary as well. This is not to say that these albums don't have the faster parts, which they do have, and actually this album right here, I can say that some of the parts are also leaning towards thrash metal, and that's, I think, what makes these albums so good, that you have such a diversity inside of them. Maybe most of the times people think of death metal as being always the same pattern, but the ability in this album is in the composition area of the tracks. They have a good mix of tempos, of approaches, and it really makes for an interesting listen. Master has always been at the forefront of death metal, regarded as one of the pioneers of the genre. Behind the band there's obviously Paul Speckman on vocals and bass, who has been the constant member throughout their career, and other members who swapped places throughout the years. The other two members are Aaron Nikias on drums, and on guitars Paul Masvidal, ex-Cynic and ex-Death, the obviously other legendary American band who are also pioneers of the genre, albeit being a bit more on the technical side. If I had to improve something on this record, it would be to have a thicker bass drum. I think it's a bit too thin, and if it had to be a bit more fuller sound, it would really add a better dimension to the tracks. Having said that, that detail doesn't really damage the whole package of the tracks, because they are still amongst the best death metal tracks you can hear, but it's just a little bit of perfectionism, so to speak. We also got Master to play Malta. It was a great show, and along the years people told me that they didn't like Paul Speckman's vocals, for example. I couldn't agree with them to a certain extent, because these kind of guttural vocals from most of the death metal musicians, but Paul Speckman has a particular approach, are just like an added instrument to the album. If any other vocalist had to sing on this album, it would feel, from my perspective, totally different. So yes, many times in heavy metal, vocals are love it or hate it thing, but in this case I really do think that they really fit the album, and I think they bring a better dimension to the tracks. In certain parts I actually think on this album, especially, Paul Speckman sounds a bit like Lemmy, the rough side of the raw kind of side of Lemmy when it regards to vocals. Anyways, this is another classic album from Master. Check out their discography. They are a very consistent band, and I'm sure you'll find a lot of albums, a lot of music for you to like. If I had to choose my favorite track from this album, that would definitely be the track Heathen. When I was starting to discover metal and the more underground bands, I found a band which was playing at the time symphonic metal. I used to appreciate that kind of sound, not really love, but every now and then I used to listen to some of these tracks. But then after a time I went to find one of the debut albums of this band. I was blown away, because it was a totally different sound to what I was hearing from the latest albums of the discography at the time. I really loved this new sound. It was menacing, it was in your face, a lot more power, and it really left an impression on me immediately. For those who haven't understood to which band I'm referring to, I'm speaking about the Swedish band Therion, and this album right here. This was released in February of 1991 by Def Records. Therion can be classified as one of the frontrunners in the Swedish death metal scene. The Swedish death metal scene is renowned for a particular sound, mainly coming from the use of guitar pedal, the HM2 Boss pedal, which created a kind of buzzsaw sound. The buzz coming from the electric saw sound, which kind of is similar to the sound you hear with Swedish death metal bands of this period of time. And Therion was one of those bands at the beginning who put forward this sound along with other bands, which became eventually really popular. Vocals are also somewhat guttural, but not as much as the previous two bands. with a more raspy approach here, or shrieky at times approach. Really gives a different dimension to the death metal we will listen to in this album here. Therion, after this album, released another death metal album, but then from then onwards they started changing their sound, evolving their sound, or devolving, depends on your point of view and on your preferences. But anyway, they diverted completely from the death metal sound. So as I said in the beginning of this description of this album, every now and then I still come back to this album because there's a longing to listen to the tracks on this record here. Maybe it's part nostalgic because it reminds me of my teen years, but this is not to say that this album doesn't hold up as one of death metal classics, and it was an easy choice for me to include it in this list. Favorite track on this album would be Genocidal Raids. I think that is my favorite track on this record. Next album in line, and I think it's a good idea to remain in Sweden, and this time round I'm going for the album by Necrophobic called Nocturnal Silence. It was released in 1993 and released with the label Black Mark Productions, owned by Stig Borje Forsberg, who was the father of Quartin from the legendary band Battery. I have done a review of Battery's Hammerheart. I'm putting a link up here, so go check it out, just in case you have never heard of Battery or never listened to the album Hammerheart, or even if you did listen to them, maybe you find some new facts about that album as well. Back to Necrophobic and Nocturnal Silence. I was doubtful at first if I was going to include this record on this list, because it's not the usual death metal album one would expect. It is more of a death/black metal album, but considering the rest of their discography, which is more black metal than death metal, not the usual black metal either, it still contains more black metal than death metal. This album on their discography, I think it leans more towards the death metal sound than the black metal sound. So I thought, yes, I will include it on this list because it's a magnificent album. This is probably the latest album I have discovered from the bands listed on this list. I don't know how many times I have heard this album now, and I liked it so much that at the time when we were drafting the lineup of the Malta Doom Metal Festival, I told my colleagues to get Necrophobic on the lineup. A year or so later that I had discovered this band, they were playing on a stage in Malta at the Malta Doom Metal Festival, so that's how much I was impressed. I was blown away by this album because it's really good. The riff after riff, shrieky vocals. The closest thing in this album to black metal is, I think, the vocals to a certain extent. Even though they are very close to black metal, they are not the traditional black metal high-pitched shrieky vocals. They have a kind of a raspy, almost a little guttural approach, yet still a bit high-pitched as well. Necrophobic, which are still going strong, as I said, I have included one of their albums on a previous video I did, which I'm linking over here as well, which is the top 20 albums, and I included their album in that list as well, so go check it out if you haven't heard that album. I think you'll find their latest output and other albums interesting as well. If I had to change something on this album, that would probably put the drums higher up in the mix. I think they are a bit too low. In certain parts they get covered by the sound of the vocals, the guitars, etc. But again, these are details you'll discover probably after a lot of listens, because once you start listening to this album, it's so good that that kind of lower sound of the drums will really not bother you, and this is an amazing album indeed. So for fans of the more popular band, this section, if you have never heard of Necrophobic, this is the album for you. If I had to choose a favorite track on this album, it's not easy, but I would go for Before the Dawn. Now we go for another album, and we'll remain in Sweden this time round, and I have chosen to put on this list probably the Swedish death metal album that really defined the genre, that really influenced all the other bands. And I'm speaking about none other than the album by Entombed, which is called Left Hand Path, released in June 1990 by Earache Records. Apparently the album title was taken from a phrase from the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey. The band also cites influence from the Evil Dead series, Hellraiser, other horror movies and series, and also the literary influence by H.P. Lovecraft. Although quite similar to the previous two albums, actually the other two albums are similar to this one because this one was released earlier, but the sound on here is a bit warmer, a bit darker to a certain extent. It induces kind of crypt-like aura, which I don't know if it's actually something that I think I have heard or read sometimes people defining the sound as coming from a crypt, but anyway, if that's not a thing, it really fits with a genre named death metal. An interesting fact is that the drums over here were recorded on a digital kit, with the exception of the snare and the cymbals, because a whole kit wouldn't fit in the studio where this album was recorded. But I think the final output did justice to the music on this record, because this record right here defined a whole genre. It's not an easy feat, and especially considering that the musicians who recorded this album were teenagers. It was their first venture, and to come up with something of this magnitude, of this heaviness and darkness and evilness, I think you need to be a good composer, you need to be have a good foresight of what you want to accomplish. This is the greatness of the albums like this and other albums who defined genres on their own or within a group of bands, because you have to be a visionary to a certain extent, and that's why these albums are still revered up to this day. Anyways, if I had to choose a favorite track on this album, it would be Left Hand Path, the title track, and it was the first track I ever heard. Of course, it's the most famous track on this album, and it remained ingrained in my head as a death metal anthem. Okay, enough with the bands from Sweden. Let's move now to the UK, although I will have another band from Sweden on this list, which I will leave for the last spot, and I think it will surprise a lot of people. They have included that album on this list, but before we go to that, we have other albums which I want to mention. And the next album from UK is from the band Carcass, and the album is Necrotism, Dissenting the Insalubrious. I'm not sure if that's the proper pronunciation of the name of the album. It has never occurred to me. It's a bit complicated to pronounce, as I obviously always refer to this album as just Necrotism. But anyways, I hope I pronounced it well. This is the third album by Carcass, released in 1991 on Earache Records. Carcass have two previous albums to this, which are regarded as the pioneers of grindcore. But on this album, their sound has changed a bit. They moved a bit towards the death metal sound. It is the first album to feature Mike Emmett on guitars. The previous two albums they played as a three-piece band, but they added another guitarist on this album, and you can really hear the power from the dual partnership of Mike Emmett and Bill Steer. Both of them, to me, most of the times bring to mind, relatively speaking, of course, because they haven't reached, so to speak, the popularity of Glenn Tipton and K.K. Downing, but these two guitarists, these two legends, come to mind when seeing especially live videos of Mike Emmett and Bill Steer. I have always said to myself, it's like they are the K.K. Downing and Glenn Tipton of death metal. And I think there was really great synergy between them, especially on this record. The lyrics over here are a bit complicated. I was searching on the internet to find information about this album, and there was a phrase which reassumed more or less the lyrics over here as economical ways of disposing of a body. That made me chuckle a bit, because I think it really captures in a few words the idea behind the lyrics of this album. But the lyrics are an interesting read, to say the least. Anyways, this is another classic album. a classic death metal album, one of my all-time favorites from this genre, my favorite Carcass album. It contains, on my favorite track on this album, which is Corporal Jigsaw Quandary, it contains one of my favorite guitar breakdowns in heavy metal history, basically. It really makes the hair on my hand stand up. It's so good. It's really powerful, and it's at the end of the track, so I'm sure once you listen to the track you will understand which part I'm referring to. But anyway, as I said, classic death metal which should not be missed. So Carcass with Necrotism, Dissenting the Insalubrious, or more or less something like that. We will remain in the UK. Once again, Britannia will rule again with another classic death metal band, which most of you will surely know, and I'm speaking about none other than Bolt Thrower with the album Those Once Loyal. This album is the 8th and final album by Bolt Thrower before they disbanded, and it was released in 2005 on Metal Blade Records. Most of you will say how come I chose the last album from Bolt Thrower. First of all, Bolt Thrower is a very consistent band throughout their career, so you won't find, or it's difficult to find an album that is better than the other album. They all have their highlights, their great moments. Although Bolt Thrower is kind of band that repeated the same formula on each of these albums, but they still remained interesting. They never became monotonous, and as far as I'm concerned, I can listen to their music all day long and never get tired of hearing it, because it contains sheer power, heaviness, and again we return over here to the kind of slowness from the first few albums that I mentioned, such as Obituary and the band Master. That slowness that creates the most power. Again, that doesn't mean, I repeat myself, that there aren't faster parts on these albums, because this is death metal, this is not doom metal, and therefore you will still get the faster parts. Well, to say the truth, even on doom metal there are faster parts. But the heaviness and the guttural vocals by Steve Willits, which is a recognizable voice in the death metal scene, still make these albums interesting from start to finish. I chose this album because it was the first album I have heard from Bolt Thrower. It was my introduction to them. It remained closest to my heart, so to speak, and it contains my favorite Bolt Thrower track, which is When Cannons Fade. In their albums, Bolt Thrower have spoken a number of times about the atrocities of war, and when you start reading the lyrics, it's like you can paint an image of trenches, of mud, of firearms, of mercenaries, and whenever I hear their tracks, it's kind of a movie that comes in front of me, and I start envisaging moments of sheer death and violence. I think when albums and music can affect you in that way, it means you really delved deep down inside that sound and really made it your own. That is another aspect of the greatness of these bands, that they really suck you in their music, and you're lost meandering those sounds by yourself. Therefore, there's not much else to say on this album other than this is another classic death metal album, as most of Bolt Thrower's, if not all of Bolt Thrower's discography. So for those who have never listened to Bolt Thrower, make sure to make amends as soon as possible. So we have arrived to the last 3 albums on this list. 2 of these last 2 albums are from the United States, so we cross the ocean once more and go to the United States of America. And the first album from these 2 is none other than one of the top bands of death metal, and one of the most consistent bands in death metal, which are Autopsy, and I have gone for the album Mental Funeral. This record was released in 1991 with Peaceville Records. Autopsy are one of the first bands in death metal in general I have ever heard, because they really embody the death doom metal sound. In 1987 there was an album by a band, an American band called Dream Death, which was called Journey into Mystery, and this album is really similar to that sound. The Dream Death band plays doom death metal. Autopsy are regarded as a death metal band, but they have a lot of slow parts, especially on this album, which really resemble that band. The first time I heard it, I was amazed at how good this album is. There's few words to explain the greatness of the sound you will get when you put this record on and push play and listen to what comes out of your speakers. It also has a very dark aura around it as well. Kudos to the musicians involved in this album. They had the ability to capture those emotions. I love every second on this album. Chris Rayford's vocals, guttural vocals, possibly one of the most deep guttural vocals you'll get to hear. He plays the drums as well on this record, which is not something you'll find often, that the drummer is the vocalist as well, but it's not rare also that it happens. There are some bands, actually I might make a video of my favorite bands which contain a drummer and a vocalist in their ranks. Could be a good idea, interesting idea. Also, something I would like to point out about Autopsy as a band is they probably have one of the most consistent lineups, at least in death metal, if not in heavy metal. That is, as a 4-piece band, 3 of them are original members, and the fourth member has been with them since 2010, if I'm not mistaken, so for a long time as well. That might be nothing to most people, but to me it indicates great respect between musicians and great connection, musical connection between them. So that kind of connection then is the catalyst for the great albums they have released throughout the years. So my favorite track on here would be Torn from the Womb. That intro to this track is ingrained in my mind, but everything on this album is perfection. By right, one of the main albums in my death metal lists, no questions asked. I mean, Autopsy are a mainstay. The next band from the US are the band which was formed the earliest and released their debut album the earliest, possibly the pioneers of death metal, and I'm speaking about none other than Possessed and the album Seven Churches. This album was released in October of 1985 with Combat Records, and at the time it was probably a kick in the face to all the metal scene, because the sheer violence and power and evilness emanating from this album, it was something that was never heard previously. This album is not only a pioneer of death metal, it is a pioneer album of extreme metal in general. Over here you will not hear the death metal that we are used to hear from the bands, at least from most of the bands listed on this list, even death metal bands that released their albums in the late 80s. The death metal you will hear in this album is in its primal movements, in its infancy, and it is mixed with thrash, some thrash parts, and it's like thrash metal taken to the extreme, with the shrieky vocals from Jeff Becerra and the guitars by Lalonde and Torrau. I mean, how can teenagers of 16-17 years of age be able to grab a guitar and release so much power, so much darkness? When you start thinking these things about these albums, and most of these albums on this list, it's like the sheer amount of almost naivety to a certain extent that these teenagers had when they grabbed their musical instruments is unbelievable. And I don't think it's possible nowadays to be so much ahead of your time, because obviously metal here was still evolving, still finding its feet, so to speak, from the 1970s hard rock scenes. Now metal was taking a specific direction with the new wave of British heavy metal, then thrash, then albums like this, then there was power metal, death metal, late 80s, and so on. So this was a time of experimentation, and Possessed and Seven Churches are amongst the top albums that have defined heavy metal in general. At the time, they used, for example, the opening track, The Exorcist, and use Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells as an intro to that album, coming from the movie The Exorcist. Those are all touches, brilliant touches, that make this album much better than if it wouldn't have used those little touches of and transitions between tracks and eerie sounds, so to speak. This album is a journey into a horror movie. Even if you just look at the cover art, I mean, it's pretty simple, yet it conveys what the music is all about. So after 35 years of this album, it still is, to a certain extent, a frightening album. It gives me the impression as the music in this album is like controlled chaos. It's very chaotic, but it's controlled. It's chaosness. I don't know if it's a word that as well. But the chaosness in here is done on purpose with a specific aim in mind. And that is why this album is so good. And if I had to choose my favorite track, it would probably be Fallen Angel. So I have arrived to the last album, and as I mentioned in the middle of the video, this album will probably surprise a lot of you. It is the album that was released the latest from the records I chose on this list, and I left it last for a purpose, because it is from a much younger band, and it, I think, encapsulates all that is good from the 80s and early 90s death metal, and brings it forward to the present time, gives it an identity, which I think is a really brilliant way of doing all of this, which is encapsulated in this album right here. And I'm speaking about the album called The Horror by Tribulation. It was released in 2009 by Pulverized Records, and if I had to liken it to one of the albums that I have mentioned on this list, that would probably be the album by Carcass, which is Necrotism. But unlike Carcass, Tribulation here focus on horror themes. They drag you into a horror house, and you're just caught in a whirlwind of death metal riffs, guttural shrieky vocals, slower parts which really build up the tension to the faster, more brutal, so to speak, parts. Every transition between each track is cleverly put in order to create that build up, keep you floored and attentive to what was coming on next. And that's why this album is so great, and aptly titled The Horror, because it's like a horror journey. As I said, the ability of the band right here is not just to grab the best things about 80s and 90s death metal, but giving it their own identity, and it is done really brilliantly on this record. It's not a copy of the other band, but it respects what the previous band have done for the genre, but uses that inspiration to create something of their own. Unfortunately, the later releases by Tribulation didn't remain focused on this kind of sound, of this kind of death metal sound, but rather they moved to a different sound, and each and every album they are today playing, as far as I know from the little that I have heard, somewhat relating to goth metal, which is really something that I am keen on. With regards to Tribulation, I kept myself listening to this album because it's enough for me, and with every listen it's like the first listen, and every now and then I have to go and put this album on because I want to hear again those tracks, which is a sensation I get with all of the albums listed here. After a certain while they pop into my mind, and I have to go and put the album on and listen to it, because that's the effect that great albums have on me, and I'm assuming on most of the listeners that like this style. Favorite track on here would be Seduced by the Smell of Rotten Flesh. These albums are all great, but as I said on previous videos, the favorite track choice for me is done so that those who have not heard the album can go and search for a specific track and see if it's to their liking. So there you have it. These are the 10 death metal albums that I have listened to most throughout the years. They have left the biggest impact on my listening. Obviously, as I said in the beginning, there are loads of other great death metal albums. So if your favorite album is not listed in my list, write it down in the comments below. I would gladly go and listen to it if I have never had the possibility to do so. If you want to suggest albums for us to review, do so as well. These videos, I do them as to start a discussion, so to speak, so everyone can pitch in and say their favorite albums, which album they think shouldn't be on this list, or are they overrated or underrated. I mean, whatever floats your boat. If you like the content, if you like the information on this video and other videos I am putting out, please consider subscribing, liking and sharing our channel and our videos on social media. It would really help us a lot in order to, as I always say, share the word of metal. Also in the description below you will find links to buy the merch of these bands I listed in this list. They are affiliate links. You buy through those links, we get a small commission, but obviously it would not add to the cost of your purchase. It will remain the same, just we get a small commission in order to be able to cover the expenses with slow upgrades we are doing in this channel with regards to equipment, which is really expensive, but when you love something you make that little bit of sacrifice in order to do it. But obviously any help will be greatly appreciated in order to cover part of these costs, which are quite high. So there is nothing more to add from my side. Thank you again for watching this video until the end, and until the next episode, stay safe and metal on. Cheers.